Everyone. Well, this morning I'd like to speak about Noah's Ark and the flood. Is it scientifically possible? But before I begin that part of the presentation, we're really looking at a much bigger question, and it's really about the origins of the universe, the origins of life. I've given this presentation since 1992, so that's 23 years. It took me about 5 years of research. I've given this presentation, I don't know, maybe 500 plus times, I have no idea. I've spoken in many of the high schools in London, in Laurier, Montcalm, Saunders, Central. I've spoken in Switzerland, in Israel, in Texas. I've spoken in churches here. I've spoken in prisons, but they did let me out. I've even spoken at Western a couple times, not during the classes, but afterwards to grad students and stuff about this topic. In fact, it took me about 5 years to put this topic together, to research it. I've met scientists who actually critiqued it. One was Kurt Wise. He's a paleontologist, got his PhD from Harvard University under Stephen Jay Gould, probably the most foremost evolutionary paleontologist in the world, and he studied under him and got his PhD. And so Kurt had looked over this, at others. And my training is I'm a civil engineer, but I like science. And so I've given this presentation so many times. I've given it in grade 12 biology classes in secular high schools. And one of the first things I say when I get up and I'm speaking to a classroom of students, first thing I say is, 39 years ago I received Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. The second thing I do is I hold up the Bible and say, I believe this is the Word of God, and it's absolutely accurate and reliable and trustworthy. Of course, the students look at me and say, you have that look on your face like, sir, you must be in the wrong class. This is not religious studies. This is biology. But the reason I make these two statements is so you know exactly where I'm coming from and why I say and believe the things I say and believe. We're going to look at a presentation about the biblical flood model. But the bigger question is, of course, the origins of the universe, origins of life. There are physicists, geologists, biologists, paleontologists, astronomers that are convinced that the universe is billions of years old and everything we see is a product of random natural processes over eons of time. But there are other scientists, physicists, biologists, paleontologists, geologists, astronomers that are convinced that the universe is thousands of years old, less than 10,000 years old, and was created in 6 natural days by God. In fact, when I went to Western in the 70s, there were professors there that believed exactly that. So you go, how is it possible that we have 2 groups of scientists, both trained in the same way, that have 2 totally different conclusions on the same topic? In fact, sometimes, have you ever seen a debate between a creationist and evolutionist? It's not very pretty sometimes. So what is really behind this whole topic? Well, the very first thing we have to understand is mankind is religious by nature. Everybody's religious. One time I met an atheist, a lady, and she said to me, I'm not religious, I don't believe in anything. She said, I don't believe in heaven, I don't believe in hell, I don't believe in a soul, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in anything. And I thought to myself, wow, there's a very religious woman. She believes there is no heaven. She believes there is no hell. She believes there is no soul. She believes there is no God. And not only was she very religious, she was very strong in her religious beliefs, because it elicited a very strong response. Of the 4,000 civilizations that have been recorded in history, there's one thing in common with all 4,000 civilizations. They've all been religious. And you know something? 21st century Western society is a religious society, and the religion is secular humanism. And it affects our educational system, it affects our politics, it affects our economic system, it affects the way we interpret history, the way we interpret everything around us. To give you an example of how powerful our beliefs affect us is, if you read a book about World War II, one written by an American and one written by a Nazi, you would see two totally different points of view. So our beliefs very clearly have a profound effect on how we interpret things. So we all operate by some degree of faith. And I take faith in this definition as the widest possible meaning, which means a belief in something without demanding proof. A belief in something without demanding proof. That's very important. That's a very broad definition of faith. Sometimes we are so immersed in a belief system that that is so pervasive in society, it is no longer recognized as a belief system. See, our predominant belief system is secular humanism, and so what do they say? They say you can't have religion in schools, but they allow secular humanism to infiltrate everything because they no longer recognize it as a belief system. And there's two basic belief systems. One would be theism, and one would be atheism. And so we could talk about theism or atheism, or another way we call it non-materialism versus materialism. When I mean materialism is someone who looks at the universe and says everything we see can be explained using physical laws and principles. Everything we see and how everything came about can be understood by physical laws and principles because there's no spiritual realm. That's a reductionist. They reduce everything to the principles of physics and say we can understand everything about life and where life came from and everything else by physical process. Once we learn those physical principles and laws. But a theist, someone who believes in the supernatural, believes in God, would believe that there's not only a material realm, but there's a non-material realm. That's why I call them non-materialists. Believe that there's a realm beyond the natural, there's a spiritual realm. So they believe that for us to understand life, we not only need to look at the physical laws in the physical realm, but we need to also understand the spiritual realm. A reductionist or materialist believes that everything can be explained solely based on what we see. Only about 9% of the population would consider themselves materialists. I want to talk a little bit what a materialist looks like and how they operate. Materialism is a philosophy that there's only the physical realm. So they would say there is no such thing as a soul. So they would say that there's no such thing as consciousness. What really is you are just electrochemical reactions, neurons firing off, that gives the illusion of consciousness. But you're really not conscious because you're just kind of like a meat computer, so to speak. Right? That's all they would say. So you think you're conscious, but it's fooling you because you're really not conscious. Right? Because you're really not a soul. But this illusion of consciousness is produced by these neurons firing off in a very complex manner. A reductionist would say that one day we will be able to develop a computer so sophisticated that it will have the illusion of consciousness and it will itself think it's conscious and we will think it's conscious. That's called artificial intelligence. I'm not speaking about husbands, I'm speaking about computers. In fact, in 1980, someone offered a reward of $100,000 for someone who could design a program that could beat a chess master. In 1997, some IBM computer programmers developed a program called Deep Blue. And in 1997, Kasparov, one of the Russian chess masters, made headlines when he was defeated by this program. And the headlines were, "Computer beats man in chess." But the commentators missed the whole point of the Deep Blue program and what went on. See, the programmers of Deep Blue were as human as Kasparov, right? They were just as human as Kasparov. So the headline should have said this. The question is, can a human who plays chess using a computer program beat a human who plays chess without using a computer program. See, it was two humans playing chess against one another. One was using a computer program and one wasn't. That's all. Do you know, when the computer program won, the computer didn't feel any satisfaction, and if it would lose, it wouldn't feel very bad about it. It's because all the computer program is binary, zeros and ones. It has no consciousness of anything. And in fact, it's interesting that in 2003, Kasparov played a much more powerful program and beat it, and tied it, sorry. He tied the program. And someone said, isn't it amazing that someone can design a program that can beat or tie a chess master? But really, see, a computer program can look at 2 or 3 million possible moves every second, while a human being can only look at 2 or 3 possible moves per second. The amazing thing is that a human could beat a program at all, or even tie it at all. And somebody asked Kasparov, saying, you know, how can it be that you only can look at 2 or 3 moves every second, while a program can look at 2 or 3 million possible moves, all the moves on the board, and that you could even tie it or beat it? And you know what he said was, but I look at the best 2 or 3. So neuroscientists who are studying this, there's one from McGill University, he wrote a book called The Spiritual Brain. And what he showed was, he showed the brain is different than the mind, the soul. And he gave some examples. And one example was, in 1991, there was a singer-songwriter, Pam Reynolds, in Atlanta. And she was 35 years old at the time, and they had discovered deep within her brain an aneurysm. And she was going to die. Because if they didn't operate, the aneurysm would eventually burst and she would die. But if they operated, because it's so deep, she would die. But at that time, someone developed a new technique for surgery, and what it was is they would cool up the body down of a person to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. At 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the brain can be without oxygen for an hour before there's any damage. Normally it's about 3 minutes. And so what it basically does is they basically kill the person. They stop all their vital functions, everything. Their brain stops, their heart stops, everything. They then withdraw the blood and re-inject it cooler at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So they cool the body from the outside and the inside all at once. And they stop the body and they cool her. So she is now a corpse. So because there was no alternative, they did this technique. They operated on her. They were successful at this. And within an hour, they were able to resuscitate her. And she was totally fine. But during the time that she was dead, there was no brain activity. She came out of her body. She then described everything that was going on in the room. She had no medical background, but she told everything what she saw and what people were saying. And then she went, this hospital was a multi-story building. She went up through the roof, up through the floors, up to the roof, and she saw on the roof a single running shoe. When they resuscitated her, she came back into her body, and she told them everything she saw, including the running shoe. They went up to the roof, and they found the running shoe. In other words, what this neuroscientist is showing, there's a difference between the brain and the soul. There's a spiritual realm. Another thing that's interesting is, people who are born blind, who have near-death experiences, when they have their near-death experience, they can see everything. Because they're no longer limited by a body that is deficient. And so, we have 2 ways of looking at the world around us. See, a theist, or a materialist would say, no, there is no spiritual realm. For those who believe in God would say there is a spiritual realm. And there's 2 ways of looking at the world around us. One is, an atheist would look at using human logic. In other words, oops, I didn't press the right button here. Okay, there. Would look at human logic, saying the way we can understand everything about life, from origins to purpose to everything, is using human logic. In other words, human logic, by deducing things, we can answer all the questions of life eventually. A person who believes in theism, believes in the spiritual realm, would say, I believe that not only by using human logic, but by divine revelation we can find truth, and the most important truths. Myself, as a believer in the Lord Jesus, as a Christian, I believe the Bible is that divine revelation. So each set has tenets. Tenets are defined as principles, beliefs, or doctrines generally held to be true, especially by an organization, movement, or religion. So in other words, tenets are things that we believe, but we cannot prove. They're assumptions. In other words, here's a picture of some of the different things, underlying assumptions between creationism and evolutionism. The first one is, as a creationist, I believe there's a God who's the eternal master and designer. Why do I believe that? The Bible tells me it's so. As an evolutionist, they would say matter and energy are eternal. They don't even know that. They don't know where energy and matter came from. They're just assuming it's always been here. That's part of their belief system. As a creationist, I believe in the fixity of kinds. I believe that each species only procreates and produces of its own kind. It doesn't change from one kind to another to another. As an evolutionist, they would believe that life goes from simple and can develop into more complex structures. That's not a fact, that's just part of their belief. I believe as a Christian in catastrophic events that have shaped the world around us, such as the Noahic flood, and has shaped the geology that we see around us today. And evolutionists believe in uniformitarianism. They say, well, there's catastrophic events, but really, compared to the slow process of eons of time, those are insignificant. It's the slow eons of time that have really shaped the universe and produced life. And as a creationist, as a Christian, I believe that man is created in the image of God. An evolutionist would believe man is a product of natural processes. Now, this is really the heart of the debate about abortion. You know, when you hear people debating about abortion, and there's one side talks about biology, when does life begin? You know, they'll talk about that. Or is it moral or is it ethical? But they're really not dialoguing on the real heart of the issue. The heart of the issue isn't about biology or about morality or ethics. It really isn't. You know what it's about? If man is created in the image of God, then abortion's wrong. But if man is a product of natural processes, and that the fetus of an animal and the fetus of a man is no different, and they're just a bunch of molecules that just when they stop, then there's nothing wrong with abortion. But if man is created in the image of God, then life is sacred. That's really the heart of the issue. So these assumptions, these underlying assumptions can never be proven or disproven. They're always accepted by faith. They're tenets. They're part of the belief systems. So back to our chart, we then look at the data. It's very interesting that we go through all this and then we finally look at the data. You know, some people think that the data is what tells us everything. Right? The data, we can look at the data, we can find truth. But the reality is when it comes to things like the origins of life, the data doesn't tell us anything on its own. If I took a whole bunch of fossils and a whole bunch of animals and geological structures and I looked at them, we all looked at them very carefully for a long time. You know what it would tell us about the origins of life? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. It's just a bunch of rocks and animals and fossils. But it's once we have our belief system, we start to look at that and take the data, which is neutral, and structure it to see if we can make a logical pattern from the way it's there. So the real heart of the issue is logic. And what evolutionists say, what people say is this: logic and truth are somehow equated. Logic and truth are somehow equated. That is the underlying assumption, a way a materialist or an atheist will try to analyze the world. By logic we can find truth. The problem is that anybody here ever did something wrong and you had a reason for it but it wasn't true? You ever had that happen? In other words, I'm saying, anybody here are liars? But you know, there's times where people do something wrong, have a logical explanation why they did it, but it's not true because the assumptions are wrong. They twisted the assumptions. In other words, your logic is only as good as your assumptions. If your assumptions are wrong, your logic will always be wrong. In fact, they surmise that the more logical something is, the more truth it must be. But the problem is, if your logic's wrong, if your assumption's wrong, your logic will always bring you to the wrong conclusion. Evolutionists discount creationists and creationism by saying it is illogical to believe that God created everything supernaturally in 6 days about 7,000 years ago. But it's not illogical to believe that. It's a faith system. It's part of a tenet of our faith. In other words, it's not about science, it's about our faith. But then creationists also are guilty of this. We say it's illogical to believe that life came from non-life, and over billions of years, all the complexity of life in the universe can be explained. But it's not illogical. It's a belief system. In other words, sometimes Christians, when we try to debate evolutionists, we talk to them as if they're silly. We talk to them in a disrespectful way. We talk to them as if they're illogical or they're foolish. But they're not. They're people with a different belief system. And sometimes even creationists use poor science to try to explain it. People are trying. But there's good science behind creationism too. But the thing is that we have to understand it's not illogical to believe that non-life can produce life. It's a religious system. It's a belief. Some scientists say that we shouldn't bring religion into the field of science. But the reality, it's already there. So why is so much money spent on evolutionism? And I use evolutionism because it's a belief system. You know, there's billions of dollars that they have spent on evolutionism, developing this theory. What's so important about it? It has no economic benefit, has no medical benefit, but there's one very important benefit of evolutionism, one very important benefit. See, every religion has to answer three basic questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going? And so for atheism to be a viable religion, it has to explain how we got here without God. And that's the importance of evolutionism. See, creationism is not illogical. And also, there's good science behind it too. You know, in the United States, there's really this push against not allowing creationism to be taught in schools. Why are they so fervent? If I was an evolutionist and I thought creation was so foolish, you know what I would do? I'd say, please teach it and let the students see how foolish it is. If someone says, we need to teach that the moon is made of macaroni and cheese, I'd say, let them come in and explain that once. Right? I wouldn't have to go to court and bar them from coming into the school system. Right? The reason is when you start to present creationism, it sounds very logical. It's very reasonable. In fact, last night, my son brought a friend here who is not a Christian, and afterwards he came up to me and said, you know something, everything you said sounds very reasonable. One time I remember I was having lunch with an engineer from Toronto. We were having a business lunch, and you know, he started talking about how everything terrible is. Says everything's getting worse, crime's getting worse, corruption's getting worse. I mean, drug addictions. He's talking. He's from Toronto, right? But anyways, as we're having lunch, I finally looked at him and said, "So, what are you doing about it?" He goes, "What do you mean? What am I doing about it?" Well, I said, "What are you doing about it?" He said, "Well, what can you do about it?" I said, "I'm doing something about it." He goes, "What do you mean? What are you doing about it?" Well, I go into the school systems and I talk about creationism. He goes, "What?" So what does it have to do with? I said, if you keep teaching kids that their life has no purpose, they're just an electrochemical reaction, and when they die, their life is ended, their existence ends, and no one else has any value, including yourself, what is going to happen to their decision making? So anyways, by the way, he didn't applaud. So it turned out he was an atheist. And so he began to say, come on, you can't believe in, what about creationism? And so I started explaining things about radiometric dating and this stuff he didn't understand before. And every time he'd say, what about this? And I explained to him, he didn't know it. You know, finally he got so frustrated, I was being friendly. Because I paid for lunch. So he finally said to me, he says, it's a good thing they don't teach us evil. Why would he say such a thing? Because you know something? He knows if there's a God, he's accountable and he's in big trouble. One time David Suzuki wrote an article in a newspaper and it said this: evolution is as well established as the earth orbits the sun. That's what he said. No one understands the process that non-life can produce life, let alone all the complexity of life developing. But he is a geneticist, a very educated man, and I believe totally honestly said that evolution is as well established a fact as the earth orbits the sun. And you go, how could he say that then? Well, you have to understand one thing about David Suzuki. He's an atheist. And there's only two ways that life can come about. There's only two ways. There's not three. Either it was created or evolved, right? There ain't a third possibility. And because David Suzuki is an atheist, he knows there is no God. So he goes, I know evolution's true because we're here. And there's only one possibility. So he made a religious statement, not a scientific one, even though he thought he made a scientific statement. And even though the people who read the article probably thought he made a scientific statement. One time I heard a geologist on the radio talking about, he was being interviewed, and somebody brought up about a worldwide flood. And as a geologist, an atheistic geologist, evolutionary geologist, said, there's no evidence for a worldwide flood. He actually made a religious statement, not a scientific one, because I believe there's a lot of evidence for a worldwide flood, which we'll look at soon. Objectivity in science has come to mean, among other things, hostility to a non-materialistic approach to origins. Skepticism, from an evolutionary point of view, is always directed towards non-materialism and never towards materialism. If you're speaking to scientists who believe in evolution, who are atheists, and you talk about the possibility of God or the supernatural, they'll immediately shut you out. Skepticism never sees the miraculous. All they see are unexplained events. Let me say that again. Skepticism never sees the miraculous. All they see is unexplained events. We've had people in this church that God has supernaturally healed. And a doctor who will see that, if he's not a believer, will say, I don't know what happened, but it just happened, but I don't believe it's a miracle. It's just something happened I can't explain. See, when we look at the evolutionism and creationism, they're not scientific theories, they're really belief systems. But they use science to show they're logical. They are logical, but they're a belief system. Because they're not theories. Because for a theory to be a scientific theory, it has to be falsifiable. It has to be falsifiable. What I mean by that is, you have to be able to set up experiments where if it's not true, it would fail. Right? That's how science works. Okay, I think if this is true, then this is true, then this will happen. So then let's set up an experiment to see if it really happens or not. If you ask an evolutionist, set up one experiment, one discovery that would prove that evolution is not true, they would not be able to find one. Every time they find something that contradicts it, they just come up with a different reason. But creationism is the same way. You can't find a way of proving there is no God or proving the way that creation didn't happen. They're not scientific theories, they're belief systems because they're not falsifiable. People also now have developed, some people who are not even non-Christians have come up with something called intelligent design. They're not necessarily creationists, but what they say is when they look at everything, they say it looks like there's a creator involved. And this is what the secular scientists say. They call it a pseudoscience. This is a definition of a pseudoscience. A pseudoscience is a claim, a belief, or a practice which is falsely presented as scientific, but does not adhere to valued scientific methods and cannot be reliably tested, or otherwise lacks scientific status. Well, evolutionism can't be scientifically tested, and creationism can't be scientifically tested. So, thank you for that definition. So when somebody says they believe in evolutionism, I go, that's very good to use the word belief. So what happens is we look at the data, and it's interesting that everybody believes in the Bible, believes in God. When they look at the data, they always come up with creationism every time. It doesn't matter if they're a farmer or an astrophysicist. And everyone who believes in that there is no God, when they look at the data, they always come with evolutionism every time. You know those famous founders of modern day evolutionism, Huxley, Lyell, Darwin, all of them first came to a point of believing the Bible was not the Word of God, and then looked at the natural world to try to explain the world without God. What's happening in the school systems is this. They show you the data, and they show you one set of interpretation of the data. What they don't tell you is there's a belief system that drives how that data is interpreted. And they also don't tell you there's other belief systems that can also logically interpret the data. So now that I've given you a little bit of the philosophy of science, now let's look at Noah's Ark and the flood. You know, I chose this story because it's probably one of the most difficult stories to believe. You know, there's a man who built an ark and put all these animals on it. There's a worldwide flood. I mean, it just sounds a little bit hokey to a lot of people. So I thought, well, let's look at that from a biblical point of view and using the same data that everybody else uses. We're not going to pull something weird out. This isn't Twilight Zone. This is just like we're going to look at the same data everybody else uses. So before I start, I want to ask a few questions. The first question is, how did Noah choose which two animals to pick of each species, of each kind? Well, you know what it says? The Bible said God brought them. It wasn't like he said, honey, could you check how many giraffes we are? Do we have two yet? It wasn't like God brought them. Then also, when Noah and his family got in the ark, how did they close that door? The Bible says God closed it. The reason I'm bringing this up is because if you take God out of the story doesn't make any sense. This isn't a story about a man says to his wife, you know, honey, maybe we should build a boat just in case. It's about a man who receives divine revelation from God, and God assists him in his endeavor. So when people say that Noah's Ark and the flood, the whole thing is hokey, it's because they've extracted God out of the possibility, and it is hokey. But if you say if there is a God, and he does intervene in our lives, then it makes sense. It's possible. And I want to touch on two extra words, proof and evidence. Let's say tomorrow morning, you'd open the London Free Press, for those who still get it, and on the front page, it would say, Noah's Ark discovered, right? And then there'd be an article on how they carbon dated the wood and stuff like that. And there'd be another article how Disneyland is trying to buy the rights to the location. But anyways, would that be proof that the biblical flood story is true? Would that be proof that the biblical flood story is true? It's not. You could say, well, how do we know who built it? And if it was really the ark or whatever, we could say it's good evidence, but it's not proof. So when we talk about the origins of life, we cannot use the word proof, because proof only works when you have eyewitnesses. And so all we can speak of is when people prove in the Big Bang, no, they haven't proven anything. Right? They find evidence that supports their belief or evidence that doesn't. That's all. So we're going to look at today evidence, not proof. So the flood occurred about 1,700 years after the creation of man. About 1,700 years. And so, first of all, this isn't the story of Noah's Ark and the flood, right? It's not a story about a happy little man with happy little animals floating on a boat. It's not a children's story. It's actually a very serious story. It's actually an encapsulation of the gospel message. It's a true event, but it's also a prophetic event. It speaks about three things. It speaks of the destructiveness of sin. It speaks about the judgment of God coming, and it speaks about salvation. In fact, when it says pitch the ark inside and out with pitch, the Hebrew word to pitch, that verb, means to atone for, to cover. It's the word to atone for. And when it says, and pitch it with pitch, that noun in the Hebrew means the price of a life. It says, cover the ark inside and out with the price of a life. And it's a picture of the redemption of Christ, putting us into the ark and protecting us from the judgment of God. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that? But it's also a true event. Anyways, how large was the ark? This, by the way, is not the truck that Noah used to move the animals in. But the ark was about 450 feet long, about 75 feet wide, and about 45 feet high. It had 3 floors. The Hebrew word for ark is taiva, and it's not a boat, it's actually the word barge. It means a rectangular vessel. In fact, at the turn of the 20th century, a Danish engineer, Peter Jansen, built a model of the ark, and he was so impressed by the load carrying capacity and the stability of it that they employed the same proportions in building their barges. Not bad for a 5,000-year-old design. The ark had a volume of about 100,000 square feet of floor space, and would have been equivalent to about 522 standard railway stock cars. So it was quite a large vessel. But the next question, but how can you fit all the animals on the ark? I mean, think about it. There's brown bears and black bears and polar bears and grizzly bears. You could fill up part of the ark just with bears. What about all the different animals? Well, to understand that, there are over 200 varieties of dogs, but they're all selected. Most of them come just by interbreeding. In other words, it's not like there were 200 different varieties of dogs, species of dogs, but there's one species, but through selective breeding, they just allowed the genetic information to be expressed in different ways. In fact, you could imagine not only that, but look at all the different dog-type animals, foxes and jackals and wolves. All these dog-type animals could come from one breeding pair of dog-type animals. In fact, since the 1700s, there are over 500 varieties of sweet peas, for those who like sweet peas. And each one of all those varieties were developed from one pair of sweet peas, one type. Isn't that amazing? See, there's two types of evolution. There's lateral evolution and there's vertical evolution. Lateral evolution is saying I can take something and I can modify or express the genetic information that's already there. Farmers have known this for thousands of years. That's how they have selective breeding, right? You have a certain type of cow that has a certain trait, so you keep breeding it with the same trait till it becomes more emphasized. You're not adding new genetic information. All you're doing is taking the same genetic information and let it be expressed in different ways. Lateral evolution doesn't create new information, it just expresses it in different ways. So lateral evolution, we say that's totally true. That's a fact. But vertical evolution is different. Vertical evolution means changing from one kind to another. In other words, adding information to the genetic information that's already there and make it more complex. That there is the belief system, saying things can go from one form to a more complex form. So lateral evolution, that's natural selection. It happens. We know about it. It's not a problem, but it's not creating new information. Vertical evolution is where you're adding new information to the DNA. In fact, we have, they say, how many races are there in the human race? There's only one race, mankind. But as man went to different localities around the world and became isolated from the general population, then certain characteristics became dominant. It wasn't like new characteristics were developed, but new characteristics became just dominant that were already in the genetic information. And as you start to interbreed a population of any people or animals, then other pieces of genetic information drop off. So you actually lose complexity, you don't gain it. So the next question is, so how many animals could the ark hold, really? Well, the ark could hold about 80,000 sheep-sized animals in half its volume, 80,000. But the average mammal is much smaller than a sheep. In fact, 5 to 20,000 species might be all that's required to provide us with all the genetic variation we see now and in the past. So we have lots of room there. Now the next question is, where did all the water come from? It says the highest mountains were covered over by over 22 feet of water. So where did all this water come from that flooded the entire world? Well, the Bible speaks about two sources. It speaks about the fountains of the great deep breaking up, and it speaks about the windows of heaven opening. And when it ends, it says the same thing. The fountains of the deep closed, and then the fountains of the heavens, or the windows of heaven closed. In other words, we see that from the Bible, it describes the flood as primarily a tectonic event which caused an atmospheric event. So the flood was primarily a tectonic event that produced an atmospheric event, and I'll go into that in a few moments. So, for us to understand this, here's a picture of the Earth, and this is the mid-Atlantic ridge. And you notice how North and South America and Africa and Asia and everything all seem to fit together really well? See, evolutionary scientists and creationists, we noticed that these continents seem to fit really well together. In other words, it looks like it was one giant supercontinent. Evolutionists call it Pangea. And so what evolutionists say, slowly over billions of years, this supercontinent split apart and started expanding and formed the Atlantic Ocean. And so we have these plate tectonics where you see the Atlantic Ocean is widening, and the Pacific Ocean is getting slightly smaller, a few millimeters every year. And this is called plate tectonics. But a person I even met, John Baumgartner, who is a PhD in geophysics, and also also has a PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles in space science. He developed a program to analyze this tectonic event. He's a creationist. And basically, what's happening is this, right now, the plate tectonics, it's a slow movement where you have part of, in the Pacific Ocean, part of the crust is being swallowed up into the mantle and melted, and then some of it is coming forth. So some have subduction, in other words, part of the crust is being sucked under into the mantle, and when it does, it slowly splits apart the Atlantic Ocean, and with accretion, some of the magma from the mantle comes up and builds a new ocean floor, and that's happening a few millimeters a year. So of course, evolutionists say, well, that's the rate, so it took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of years for the Atlantic Ocean to form. Because it's assuming steady state, assuming consistent slow motion. And of course, we see the same thing with subduction. This would be like California, where the plates, one plate is being sucked under the lithosphere into the mantle and melted. And of course, in the Atlantic, some accretion is going on, some of the magma is coming forth as the ocean's splitting forward, and it's forming a new ocean bottom. Well, what Dr. Baumgartner did was he used a program, engineers like using this too, it's called finite element method. In other words, you take an object and you break it into tiny little cubes, very tiny cubes, and each cube represents a number of the properties of the, like for instance, viscosity, thermal conductivity, modulus elasticity, many different properties. And of course, the Earth is a complex structure of, you have the lithosphere, you have the mantle, you have the core, and there's layers within that. So he basically took the properties they know about, and he programmed it to actually model the entire Earth from the core out. And then what he did was he then did what the Bible said. He allowed, so there's one supercontinent, like that they believed, and they have this huge Pacific Ocean, and he allowed a crack to form and allowed the crust of the ocean bottom, the lithosphere, to start sinking down into the mantle. And he let the program go. And what he found was this. This is actually the program. In 15 days, this is dropping down, this is the mantle, the lava, magma. In 15 days, the lithosphere dropped down into the magma to hit the core. To give you an idea, what I'm saying is the lithosphere, this is like the whole Earth is floating on a raft about 15 kilometers thick, the oceans and the continents, and that's the lower lithosphere. On top of that are the continents, the mountains and the dry land, and those are between 20 and 35 kilometers thick. And so what you have is you have the lithosphere, so the crust at the ocean bottom is about 15 kilometers, and on the Earth's surface it's between 25 and 65 kilometers thick, depending on if you're on mountains or not. So and then you have the mantle, which is the magma, which is about 2,900 kilometers thick. And then you have the core, which is around 3,500 kilometers thick. So you have a little raft of this crust, about say 60 kilometers thick. You have this liquid rock, the mantle, which is about 2,900 kilometers thick. And then you have this core, which is about 3,500 kilometers thick. So what happened is when this started sinking down, it dropped down in 15 days. That crust of the ocean bottom hit the core. It traveled 2,900 kilometers in 15 days. Now this isn't hocus pocus, this is science. This is modeling the Earth exactly the way it is, he used two super Cray computers to model all these elements. So it was amazing that we see here that something that we were saying as creationists a long time ago was proven mathematically. And so what's happening is this. You see that as the Pacific Ocean would crack open and start sinking down, it's now dragging the continents with it, right? And it's dragging from both directions, so what's doing, it's tearing apart this supergiant continent. It's tearing it apart. It's sort of like having a sheet and having a tablecloth with dishes on it, and if you'd pull the tablecloth down, the dishes would slide along with it. And so as the ocean bottom is being dragged down into the mantle, it's pulling the continents apart. But not slowly over hundreds of millions of years, but quickly over a period of days. And at the same time, as this is sinking down, now the Pacific Ocean is getting smaller, and the Atlantic Ocean is starting to form. Now, something that's very interesting about this too is that the Atlantic Ocean, as it was forming, as it was coming, this hot magma was coming up, it would hit the ocean water, and as it would produce jets of steam. So what's happening is you're getting these jets of steam, which produces precipitation. So we see it's a tectonic event that produced an atmospheric event. So now where did all the water come from then? So imagine this, as the Pacific Ocean is getting smaller, the Atlantic Ocean is getting larger, but the new Atlantic Ocean bottom is rock now that's forming, but it's hot. And because it's hot, it's about 10% less dense, which means it's about a 1.5 kilometers shallower than the original Pacific Ocean. So as the water rushes into this new Atlantic Ocean, it's actually 1.5 kilometers shallower. So what's happening is the water is now being forced onto the lands, right? Because it's being displaced. And at the same time, you're having this tremendous amount of precipitation. So you're having a tremendous amount of powerful storms, and you're having water rushing onto lands as this is coming on from the Atlantic Ocean. So we're having waters being displaced. Now, I've given you a scenario of the lithosphere sinking down into the mantle, but is there any evidence for such a global scale catastrophe? Is there any evidence of such a thing? Well, it's interesting. They have something called seismic thermography, where they're able to calculate the temperature and the composition of rock deep inside the earth. And what they found is this, that if you see these blue areas and these red areas, this is the mantle, they have areas that are hot and areas that are cooler in the mantle. Now, if the earth was billions of years old, then the mantle would be homogeneous in temperature and composition, right? It would all melt. But we see here that there's an inclusion of cold rock sometime in not the too distant past. Because if the cold rock was in there for any length of time, it would have melted. If it's there for more than 10,000 years, then it would be homogeneous in composition. In other words, there's this huge area of cold material in the mantle that has not yet totally melted and is not the same temperature. In other words, there is huge areas, inclusions of cold material in the mantle. That's evidence, very good evidence, that something catastrophic happened in not the too distant past. So the Genesis flood was primarily a tectonic event involving rapid recycling of the pre-flood ocean floor into the Earth's interior. So that's what it is. What was happening is in the Pacific Ocean was getting smaller as the ocean bottom was falling into the mantle, and as it was, the new Atlantic Ocean was forming, and water was rushing in, and it was a shallower ocean. I want to give you an idea about what water can do, because for you to really understand what a flood model looks like and what the geological evidence should look like, you need to understand a little bit about water. And so here's a picture of, one thing I want to say just before I end this point is that in the Genesis flood, it says this. It says the fountains of the great deep broke open. The word fountain, we think of liquid water, but it could be liquid rock. The fountain says it pours out. And then it says it broke open. And in the Hebrew, it doesn't mean broke up. It means being torn apart in two. And that's exactly what we see in this tectonic. Anyways, back to this. Here's a picture of a dam on the it's called the Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River. And in 1983, it's a very large dam, as you can see. They had a record spring rainfall, and the water started coming so quickly on to the dam that it was in danger of overflowing the dam and causing a tremendous amount of damage. So for the first time in the history of the dam, they were forced to open these 4 sluice gates. And those tubes are 40-inch reinforced concrete tubes, 41 foot in diameter. And for the first time, they opened them full capacity because they had to get the water out from behind that dam. And they ran that for a number of days. And as they were doing it, they noticed there was a rumbling sound and material was being ejected from those tubes. And afterwards, when they were able to stop the flow, when they got inside, this is what had happened is, there's a 41 foot concrete lined tube, 40-inch diameter. The water had cut through the 40 inches of reinforced concrete and up to 30 feet of sandstone bedrock and pulverized it. It took solid rock and solid concrete and broke it up. Some pieces were as large as trucks. Others were pulverized to very small pieces. In fact, when they went inside, this is what they found. The entire 40-inch reinforced concrete liner had been totally eroded, totally decimated, and up to 30 feet of sandstone bedrock. In other words, under engineered controlled flow, solid rock and solid concrete can rapidly be pulverized and turned into sediments. In fact, as an engineer, we have used high pressure water to demolish concrete. It's faster and it's quieter. And another thing we'd expect in a worldwide catastrophic event is we would expect volcanic activity. Not only would we expect a lot of tectonic events in terms of erosion and plate movement, but a lot of volcanic activity. So these are 2 aspects of... Now another question I have is this. How long was the flood? How long did the flood last? When did the rain stop? How many days? 40 days. 40 days and 40 nights. That's what I always believed, but that's not true. The Bible doesn't say it lasted 40 days and 40 nights. In fact, if you look at it, the first 7 days, they're just waiting in the ark, right, before anything happens. And then it was 150 days before the rain stopped, before the floodgates closed and before the fountains of the great deep closed up. It was 150 days. In fact, they didn't get off the ark till 378 days, over a year. So why do we always believe that after 40 days and 40 nights the flood stopped? Well, it's because 3 important things did happen during the flood at 40 days and 40 nights. The first thing it said is the ark began floating. It took 40 days for the waters to finally get the ark to float. The second thing is it took 40 days for waters to finally cover the earth, which shows the ark was built way up high. So it took 40 days for the water to cover the earth, to have the ark float, and finally all life on earth that wasn't on the ark to die. Okay, so that was an important thing. But there still was another 110 days of flooding. Why do I bring this point up? Well, from 2 points of view. And from a Christian point of view, we need to be careful that when we read the Bible what it really says, not what we think it says. See, our belief system can sometimes stop us from really reading what it says. You know, so what we need to do is we ask the Holy Spirit, Lord, help me to read what it really says, not what I think it says because I've been told it says that. But from a scientific point of view, it's very important too. Because you can imagine this, it wasn't like the floods came and after 2 or 3 days everything's flooded. The floods, remember, a few days went by, a week went by, we have all the sedimentation being produced, all this stuff. And it's like 1 week and 2 weeks and 3 weeks and maybe after 2.5 weeks, now the water's starting to inundate the lands. It's coming on the lands more and it's getting higher and higher and all the animals are running to higher ground and it's flooding. And finally after 40 days everything's flooded. So when we look at the geological column, what do we see? We see at the bottom of the geological column, we see marine life, marine fossils. As we get near the top of the geological column, we see marine life and also we see amphibians and reptiles and mammals. So what is the evolutionary way of interpreting that? Life began in the oceans and finally developed onto the lands, right? But what's a creationist point of view? The floods began in the oceans and finally inundated the lands. Right? Because when the first 3, 4, 5, 10 days, the animals are saying, let's run in and get drowned. They're running for higher ground. Right? And so the only things found at the bottom of the fossil record are marine life. But as you get farther up, you still find marine life, but you also find mammals, reptiles, amphibians. So now, where did all the water go? And now we got the water here. Now, how do we get rid of the water? Well, the Bible speaks about a very simple situation, is that the waters ran off the lands. Ran off the lands. So where would it run to? It'd run into the oceans. So how could this happen? Well, let's go back to what's happening. Remember, the Atlantic Ocean is thicker, but remember, it was a year before they got off the ark. Now what's happening is the Atlantic Ocean, the lithosphere, the crust of the ocean, the bottom of the ocean, is now cooling, and it's shrinking down. As it's shrinking down, the water's running back into the oceans, right? Because now the Atlantic Ocean is becoming deeper and deeper as the rock is cooling. There's just something else that's happening at the same time. In the Atlantic Ocean, because of the subduction and the sucking down of this, all of a sudden the Atlantic Ocean is becoming deeper. In fact, in the trench of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, it's up to 11 kilometers deep. So two things are happening. The Atlantic Ocean's cooling, the crust of the Atlantic Ocean's cooling, so the Atlantic Ocean is now getting deeper. And at the same time, the subduction has drawn the bottom of the Pacific Ocean deeper. So the waters are running off into the Atlantic and to the Pacific Ocean. And something else is happening. With this plate tectonics, it's pushing the continents up, right? You're getting all this movement as these plates are hitting one another, and the continents are being forced up. So you have the continents being forced up, and at the same time, you have the oceans deepening. And so the water's running off. In fact, if you took the earth and made it smooth as a billiard ball, there'd be enough water on the surface of the earth to cover the entire globe 2 miles deep. 2 miles deep. So where did all the water go? It's still here. It's just been redistributed. So what evidence would we expect if there was a worldwide flood? Well, what we'd expect is if I had a house and it was built near a river or something, and there's a big flood, when I finally pumped out all the water from my basement, what do I expect? I expect to find a lot of mud, sand, and silt. Maybe some of my neighbor's furniture floated in, but basically a lot of mud, sand, and silt, right? That's what a flood does. It always produces that. And when we look around the world, we see that 75% of the earth is covered by sedimentary rock, material that was deposited by water. And the average thickness of that is between 1 and 1.5 miles thick. And the sedimentary rock is made up, 70-80% is made up of clays, silts, and sands, and 15% limestone, and a few esoteric materials. But basically, 75% of the earth is covered between 1 and 1.5 miles of mud that is hardened and turned into rock. And actually, 99% of fossils that are found, 99% of fossils that are found have been deposited by water. Here's a picture of Angel Falls in Venezuela. It's 20 times higher than Niagara Falls. It's made up of sandstone bedrock. 20 times higher than Niagara Falls. And all this material is deposited by water. Here's a picture of the Rocky Mountains. Some of these peaks are over 9,500 feet above sea level. 9,500 feet above sea level. You know what's interesting about these sedimentary rocks? This is all sedimentary rock, material deposited by water. And in those rocks, on top of those mountains, embedded in those rocks are marine fossils. There are marine fossils embedded 9,500 feet above sea level. This is where both creationists and evolutionists agree. They agree that at one point, these mountains were under the oceans and were lifted up. You know, even on top of Mount Everest, 29,000 feet above sea level, they find fossil clams. Fossilized clams on top of Mount Everest. You know, there's one thing I can say, I can say this with certainty. Clams don't fly. So we know that these mountains were covered by the oceans. So the only difference is how long did it take? The evolutionists and creationists both agree that these continents were covered by water. And somebody says there's no evidence for a worldwide flood? But what they do is they look at it and say, yes, but it was covered over, many, many years, and slowly over hundreds of millions of years was lifted up. As a creationist, I say that I believe that they were laid down quickly and then they were lifted up quickly. Is there any evidence to show that the material was laid down quickly and then lifted up quickly? Well, when I was in university, I took a course in geology, and the professor said it's amazing how solid rock can bend without cracking. You know, as a structural engineer, you can calculate the stresses. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. You cannot bend solid rock and it doesn't crack. In fact, if here's a picture of the Rocky Mountains, they're called fold mountains. You know why they're called fold mountains? Because they're folded, right? I mean, didn't take a lot of imagination to come up with that name. But the thing is, but you look at it, but they're not cracked. How could solid rock bend without cracking? Well, this is the creationist model. The layers of sand and silt and clays were laid down very quickly over a period of months. And while they were still soft, the continents are still moving. They're being compressed now by other tectonic plates. And as they're being compressed, this soft material is being bent, right? And that would explain the reason they were able to be bent is they weren't hard yet. They were still soft. Now, then we say, hey, that must be proof then. Well, there's one way that solid rock can bend without cracking. And that's if you take solid rock and you subject it to high temperatures, the rock will be actually malleable where you can actually bend it without cracking it. The only problem is, if that happens, the rock has a chemical signature. It's called being metamorphosized. And these rocks don't show any sign of being under high temperature. They're not metamorphosized. Now we can say, well, then we've proven that it happened this way. No, we can't use the word proof. All we can say is, knowing what we know about science today, we don't have an explanation. But it doesn't mean that scientists may find a way that solid rock can bend without cracking. We just don't know there is a way. So we don't want to be so arrogant saying, see, you evolutionists, you don't know what you're talking about. No, all we can say is, this evidence, this data, supports very nicely a creationist model, a young earth creationist model. But we don't want to be nagging at them or putting people down. Because I used to be an evolutionist, and I want you to be nice to me too. Right? So, but we can see it very nicely supports what we'd expect. Another thing we were taught in university is that canyons and river basins, these geological structures were formed over eons of time, millions and millions of years by slow running water. Here's a picture of the Grand Canyon, and you can see it's some places up to 18 kilometers thick, wide, up to 18 kilometers wide. And the Colorado River in some places looked like a little narrow channel compared to the width of the Colorado, the Grand Canyon. So how can we understand how these type of geological structures could be shaped and formed in a young Earth model? Well, we're going to go to something that happened in 1980, Mount St. Helens. Now, I'm not sure how many people are old enough to remember that. Unfortunately, I am. But anyways, in 1980, in Washington State, there was a mountain called Mount St. Helens, and there was a 4.5 square mile lake called Spirit Lake, in a beautiful, pristine forest. But anyways, something was happening in the months previous to the eruption, and scientists knew it was going to happen. So everybody got up there and were watching very carefully to really see about this eruption, to study it. And what was happening is the north side of the mountain began swelling between 3 and 5 feet every day in elevation. It started rising more and more and more. And as it was lifting up, because of all this pressure building up within it. And after it was about 300 or 400 feet above its original elevation, finally on May 18th, 1980, it erupted. And erupted with such force that it was equivalent to a 20 million tons of TNT going off initially. And then the force of the eruption continued for 9 hours, equivalent to an atomic bomb the size dropped on Hiroshima going off every 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds for 9 hours, that was the amount of energy that was being released from that. And it blew pieces of rock up to 8-9 miles away. And so what happened too is that as the north side of the mountain, when it finally erupted, the north side of the mountain slid off and slid down into Spirit Lake. A half a cubic mile of mountain slid down, the north side slid down, hit that lake, half of that avalanche hit that lake, which is a quarter of a cubic mile, hit that 4.5 square mile lake. And when it did, it forced a huge wave of over 850 feet high to wash up in the surrounding mountains and wash into the lake over 1 million trees. So what happened after the eruption is, so the north side of the mountain slid down, this quarter of a cubic mile actually hit the lake, and when it all settled out, the bottom of the new lake was higher than the top of the old lake, and on top of that were 1 million trees. So you got that? The entire old lake was filled in, on top of that a new lake was floating, and on top of that there were 1 million trees. And this is a picture of what the mountain looked like, The dotted line was where it was before it slid down, and this is the north side of the mountain that slid down towards us. Here's a picture of before and after. And at the same time, when that north side of the mountain came off the mountain peak, there was a steam explosion. And the steam explosion was so powerful that in 9 minutes, it leveled 150 square miles of forest. And so this is just a picture of part of the forest just blown down by the steam explosion. It leveled, these trees were like, some of them were up to 150 feet long. So this is just a really big aerial photograph. 150 feet long. In fact, there were enough trees knocked down to build 650,000 three-bedroom bungalows. There's a picture of me in 1992. I'm holding up one of the trees. But that's what, you can see the size of some of these trees that were knocked down. And this is another picture I took in 1992, about 10 years later. And you can see once where these pristine forests, all buried by sedimentary material. Now here's a picture of this area. Now this is what it looked like in 1992, about 10 years afterwards. And if you look at this, all this is avalanche debris from the eruption. Underneath this was a forest, all wiped out. And then in 10 years, 5 canyons formed. Look at those 5 canyons. This canyon here is a 1/40th scale of the Grand Canyon. It's 100 feet deep and 200 feet wide, and it meanders just like the Grand Canyon. But all these 5 canyons were formed within the first 10 years of the eruption, after the eruption. Isn't that amazing? If I showed you this picture and said to you, this is a landscape that is 200 million years old, you go, yep, looks like 200 million years. Why do we believe it looks like it's 200 million years old? Because that's what we've been told things look like when they're old. But this is what things look like when they're young, too. So you see how our belief system affects the way we interpret things. Here's a picture of another canyon. This is 100 feet deep and about 200 feet wide. See that little creek running through it? People would think, well, that creek formed this canyon over millions of years. But the reality is, the creek didn't produce the canyon. The canyon actually produced the creek. It was actually a much greater, they had floods, and these floods would quickly cut through and form these canyons. Here's a picture of another one. This is 140 foot, this is avalanche debris that went right across after the Mount St. Helens eruption, and then from rapid flooding, the water cut through quickly and formed the canyon 140 feet high. Do you see a person standing right up there? So that whole canyon was formed rapidly within months. Now you may say, well, wait a second, Howard. The reason those canyons formed rapidly is the material is soft, so of course the water would cut through it quickly. Well, there's 2 things I have to say about that. The first thing is this, that after the flood, the material would be soft, right? And the second thing is that there's another part of the canyon, and this is my son Jacob. He's now 33, but this time he was 10. This is one of the geologists on the trip. This canyon was formed in the late summer and fall of 1980. This is also in Mount St. Helens. There was a huge slurry of mud and water that shot down there in a few months. And it actually cut a canyon 100 feet deep through solid basalt. Basalt is an igneous rock as hard as granite. So within a couple months, they observed this canyon 100 feet deep cut through solid rock. So we see that not only does water cut through soft material and form canyons, it cuts through hard material and forms canyons. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon again, and they call it an underfit canyon. The reason they call it underfit is you see the river it services is so much smaller than the cross-sectional area of the canyon. And so what it sort of implies there was a much greater volume of water flowing through it than there is now. In fact, scientists, evolutionary scientists, are now coming to the opinion that at the source of the Grand Canyon was a huge quantity of water that burst open and quickly rushed down and very quickly formed the Grand Canyon. That the Grand Canyon was not cut slowly over millions and millions of years. This is evolutionary geologists saying this now. And they even located the source where they see this huge amount of water was trapped, and then it broke open and cut through. Now, let's go back to our flood model. Imagine this now. The waters are running off into the oceans, and there's oceans of water trapped on the continent still. And as they're rushing off, they're now forming the major river basins and canyons in the world very rapidly. In fact, every major river basin and canyon in the world shows evidence of it being underfit. In other words, every major river basin and canyon in the world shows evidence that at one time a much greater volume of water flowed through it. In fact, there's something very interesting too. If you look at a topographical map of the ocean, of the continents and the ocean continental shelves, you'll notice something. Many of the river basins and canyons, when they hit the ocean, they don't stop, but they actually cut through the continental shelf into the deep ocean. Now, if a river is normally flowing, once it hits the water line, it just dissipates the energy. But it means there was a huge amount of force that continued cutting through the continents and then through the continental shelf under the ocean until it hit the deep ocean. So in other words, we see good evidence of catastrophic events that formed these river basins and canyons. Another thing I was taught was layers of rock represent time. This is varved shale, so each layer is about a millimeter thick, and so maybe there's about 25 or 30 millimeters thick. So you might have 30, 40, 50 years of deposition, because every layer would be kind of like a heavy flood or something would give a fine line of deposition. So if you had hundreds of feet of that, you would have millions of years. So how do we look at this type of stratification and analyze it in terms of a young Earth? Well, let's go back to Mount St. Helens again. In June 1980, there was another steam explosion, and there was what we call a pyroclastic flow. What a pyroclastic flow is, it's a ground-hugging slurry of avalanche debris, but instead of mixed with water, it's mixed with hot gases. And so it still flows, and it flowed about over 100 miles an hour, and in 9 hours, it deposited 25 feet of material. In 9 hours, it deposited 25 feet of material. That was from 9 hours. And when you get close to it, look at it, how finely layered it is. In fact, I had a paleontologist who told me the standard way of interpreting this type of layering. See these fine layers, those represent seasonal rains. But every 25 or 50 years you have a really major storm. It causes major erosion. And you have more thick particles or larger particles. So there's a 25-year storm, there's another 25-year storm, there's another 25-year storm. So there maybe you have like 50 years of deposition within a few inches. But in reality, all 25 feet formed within 9 hours. In other words, what we see is that things layer naturally and layer in such a way that can be interpreted as something that took great ages when they actually happened very quickly. Here's another picture of the Grand Canyon, and you notice something about it, layers, all these layers. Well, when you look at the layers, there's nothing in between, there's nothing growing. If each layer was laid down and then it was there for a year, things would grow, things would be disturbing it. But we see layer after layer after layer with no breaks in it, nothing, no contamination. And that speaks to me about something that was laid down quickly over a very short period of time. Here's a picture of more sandstone, and these layers are bent. The reason is it was bent up after it was laid down. But if I took you to a valley and I said, there's sedimentation in the bottom of the valley, I said, where did this sedimentation come from? And you may say, well, when it rains off the hills, it erodes and deposits in the valley. And that's very reasonable because that's what happens. But there are layers of sedimentary rock that can be traced across the entire United States. There are layers of sedimentary rock that can be correlated across even into Europe, even into Australia. So what are these layers of rock that can be correlated not only across continents, but across other continents? What mechanism could lay material that could cover huge, vast areas? Well, a worldwide flood would provide one of those possible mechanisms. Another thing, but what about fossils? We've been told that fossils are evidence of great ages and of evolutionism. So how can we reinterpret the same data? Well, here's a picture of a fossil fern. And one thing about ferns, right, or about any plants, if you want to preserve them, you got to bury them really quick. See, my plan was always in the fall is, my wife said, well, rake the leaves. I said, well, if you just wait long enough, it'll all decompose, right? So when you see well-preserved plants, you know that they were buried quickly. Here's a picture of a fish. Now, I want to make this statement. I make this statement, I feel very confident about this one also. This fish did not die of indigestion. It was rudely buried during lunch. There is, and you look at the fossil record, you look at evidence for rapid burial. There's even found fossils of fish in the midst of giving live birth when they were being buried. So we're seeing something, so it's not a matter of something dies and gets buried, it's a matter of something happened catastrophically over and over and over again. You see that. Now there's another thing that's interesting in the fossil record is trees. Some of these are over 20 meters high vertically. Now, this is a problem for the evolutionists, but it's a problem for the creationists too. Because you think, well, wait a second here. You have a tree that is 60 feet high through layers that are supposed to be multi-millions of years old. Well, we know from an evolutionary point of view, you can't have a tree sitting there for like 60 million years while it's slowly being buried in deposition. So how do we deal with what we call polystrate fossils? Fossils that run through multiple layers, up to 20 meters. But then the evolutionists say, wait a second, Howard, okay, maybe we can't explain it, but what about you? What do you say? Because it's not just one tree, there's multiple trees in this. So how can we understand that? Because did the flood stop, the trees grew, and the flood happened again, and then the flood stopped, and the trees grew, and the flood stopped again? Like, how do we explain that? Well, we're going to go back to Mount St. Helens again. Remember I said there were over 1 million trees floating on Mount St. Helens. Well, then they started getting waterlogged, but because they were torn out by their roots, right, they started floating vertically. And when they went down, what they found is they're being buried at different times. And if you looked at this, you would say, oh, this tree grew first, and then this tree grew later, and this tree, so this is 50 years, and that's another 100 years, and there's another 200 years. But in actual fact, these trees didn't grow there at all. They were pulled up by a catastrophic event, and then sunk down and were buried in the sediments, but they looked like they were growing there. Here's a picture of a plaque in Yellowstone Park, and this is what it says. Buried within the volcanic rocks that compose the mountains are 27 distinct layers of fossil forests that flourished 50 million years ago. Well, wow, you go, whoa, what's happening there? So imagine this, there's 27 layers of forest, a layer of forest, another one atop one another for 50 million years. So how do we explain that in terms of our flood model? Well, let's go and look at some of these trees. Here's a picture of two of these trees in Yellowstone Park. Anywhere where the tree roots are exposed, we find that they've been broken off about 1 meter from their trunks. What does that tell us? These trees never grew there in situ. They were actually ripped out by the roots and deposited there just like we saw in Mount St. Helens. In other words, these 27 layers of forest weren't forests that grew there. They were from catastrophic events that dropped them down. Otherwise, the roots would be fossilized right down to the extreme fibers. But they've been broken off about 1 meter from the roots. Now, what about dinosaurs? You know, one thing about dinosaurs, you don't bury these things slowly. You either bury them right away or you get out of there, right? I mean, these are big animals. In fact, even if he's dead, if he doesn't get buried quickly, he's going to rot, right? In other words, when we look at dinosaurs, they are wonderful evidence of rapid deposition, of catastrophic events, these huge animals. Not only that, but these animals were buried so rapidly that the weight of the earth on top of them, the material on top of them, was compressing them. And one thing about dinosaurs too, okay, I'll go on to, how long does it take to form fossils? You know, how long does it take to take something and fossilize it? And actually, they have found fossilization is actually a very quick event because it's not about time as much as chemistry. Here's a picture of a hat in Australia. It was abandoned in a mine. And 40 years later, somebody came back, and in 40 years, it had become petrified. Become limestone in 40 years, just the minerals dripping on it. So in 40 years, we have a limestone hat. Here's a picture of another hat. This hat was found in 1885. There was a volcanic eruption, buried a huge area in volcanic ash in New Zealand. And 20 years later, as they're digging out, they found a number of items that had fossilized, including this hat. So in 20 years, a hat was turned into a fossil. In fact, one time I said to my wife, I wanted some mushrooms. And she goes, what for? I said, well, I want to fossilize them. She kind of gave me a funny look. So I took natural minerals, and I just soaked it in that for a few days, and within a few days, it had been fossilized. It actually kept the same color. And I had it around for years. If you have a mushroom, you leave it on your counter, within a couple of days it's gone. But I was successful to fossilize it and preserve it. My wife wasn't really that encouraged or impressed by it. But anyways, and why I use mushrooms is because the cell structure will quickly absorb the minerals. So basically, fossilization is just where minerals are coming and replacing the cell structure. And there's actually 5 different chemical ways that fossilization can occur. In fact, they have measured in nature trees that have fallen into high mineralized water of fossilizing up to 6 millimeters a year. So it's not a matter of time as much as chemistry. Now the next thing is, well, how long does it take to form sedimentary rock? How long does it take to take sands and clays and silts and turn them into rock, lithify them as we call it? Well, an example would be, a poor example, but would be like concrete. And what we do is we take aggregate, sands, silts, and we mix it with cement, and the crystals grow and form a structure. That's kind of like what happens with rock. And actually, to give you an idea of that would be, they have found beach rock that it was so quickly lithified, they found a Coke bottle embedded in it. And it was as hard as statuary marble. That's how hard the rock was. So nothing we expect is, imagine Noah and his family, right? Everybody else gets wiped out. So they would talk about that a lot, wouldn't they? Sort of like we have Thanksgiving dinner, once a year. Well, they would have whatever. And they would tell their children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So we'd expect that if all the families of the world came from that one family, that these stories of the flood would continue on. In fact, when we look around the world, this is what we find. The Babylonians have a flood story. The Greeks have a flood story. The Indians have a flood story. North American Indians, South American Indians, the Pacific, all around the world. There's over 200 flood narratives have been recorded. 95% state that the flood was global. 88% state that a favored family was involved. 66% state that the flood was due to the wickedness of man. 57% state that the survivors eventually ended up in a mountain. And 9% state that specifically 8 people were saved. Now, if I was an evolutionist, I'd say, wait a second, Howard, wait a second. The reason that they have flood stories is people build near rivers and stuff because they want to be close to water, and there's floods, and so things get wiped out. That's why there's so many flood stories. And you know what I would say to that? That's a very good point. That's very logical. That's true. That's a way of interpreting this data. There's nothing wrong with that. But do you see the point? 95% state that it was global. This is exactly what I'd expect if it was a global flood. In other words, just because they have a logical way, I don't have to attack them on their logical explanation. All I have to do is show them that the data is very supportive of what I would believe should be seen if there was a worldwide flood. Here's a picture of a bristlecone pine tree in the White Mountains of California. This tree, this one was 100 years old when the picture was taken. The oldest tree found in tree ring counting found is 4,200 years old. These trees seems never to die, but the oldest living creature is only about 4,200 years old. What happened? Maybe something happened about 5,000 years ago. Recorded history only goes back about 5,000 years. There is no recorded history before that. Now people say, well, that's because they all learned to write at once. Well, that's possible. But it's also possible that civilization was wiped out and began again. Now what about dinosaurs? Like we've told that dinosaurs are evidence for evolutionism and great ages. Well, here's a picture of a coelacanth. This one fossil is purported to be 140 million years old. And they believe that coelacanths became extinct at 65 million years. Until they caught one off the coast of Madagascar in 1932. And they've caught a number of since, and they find them swimming around. So why do they think that these coelacanths were extinct for 65 million years if they're still around? There's a very simple reason. When they look at the fossil record, they only find coelacanths down in the bottom of the fossil record, not higher up. And so they think that, okay, they were living at this time, but later on they became extinct. Because they look at the geological column in terms of time. The deeper it is, the older it is. But remember, as a creationist, I look at the geological column not according to time, but according to location. In other words, the deeper it is because that's where it was, deeper. In other words, these fish swim very deep in the oceans only. And since they're found only deep in the oceans, that's why they're at the bottom of the fossil record. And since they're not at the top of the fossil record because they stay on the bottom of the ocean. In other words, their location isn't due to time, I believe, but it's due to locality. And so in fact, many legends of dragons, right? The Europeans have them, the Chinese have them, the Japanese have them, and some of them sound very familiar to certain types of dinosaurs. But the first dinosaur bones were not identified and dug up till the 1820s. But these legends are thousands of years old. I believe that people had actually encountered them. I believe they were on the ark, and later on they became extinct, but they were around, and that's why we have these legends. And the last slide that we're going to deal with is, we talked about Noah's, oh yeah, one more thing about dinosaurs. That in Hell's Creek Formation in Montana, they found dinosaur bones with red meat still contained in the bone. They found soft tissue, defined cell matrices, elastic blood vessels, and even microstructures of nuclei had been seen in this material. And the evolutionists were both shocked and astounded. Something that's supposed to be millions of years old still has soft tissue, even with some of the DNA still intact. Anyways, the last picture is Mount Ararat. The first thing I'd like to say is, it doesn't say that the ark landed on Mount Ararat. It said it landed on the mountains of Ararat. We don't know which one. A lot of people traditionally choose this mountain. But if you look at this mountain, right, and how could Noah, his wife and family and all those animals get down from that mountain? I remember I did this in a grade 12 biology class one time, and a student said maybe they skied down. I just never thought about that. But if it was my kids, they would have snowboarded down, right? So, but the thing is, the reason is that these mountains have experienced 5,000 years of glaciation and volcanic activity. They look different than they do now. There's reports of Noah's Ark and the flood and people finding it. Nobody's found Noah's Ark up to this point. And it's very possible it could be buried or destroyed in this type of extreme catastrophic events. Because I believe that when the Ark landed, these mountains were actually rolling soft mountains. But after 5,000 years of glaciation and volcanic activity, they've been reshaped to look the way they do. So in conclusion, the Ark was large, that only several thousand species of animals might be required on the Ark. The sedimentary rock and the fossil record could have been formed rapidly during the flood. Mountains, canyons, and other geological structures could have been formed rapidly as the waters receded. And most cultures and people have a flood story. And recorded history only goes back about 5,000 years ago. Noah's Ark and the flood, is it scientifically possible? I believe it is, but it's up to each person to choose what they're going to believe. Anyways, I know I probably exhausted you, but if you have some questions, we can address it. But if you're going to, you need to come to the microphone. And if you thought that's enough, I'm overloaded, that's totally fine too. So is there any questions?